I'm a professional diver. I've got a couple of stories of my own that I can go in depth with, but I've got a ton more interesting stories from other divers. I can't speak to the truth of them because I wasn't there. Some are pretty out there. Keep in mind, some of these stories are sort of like diver urban legends. They get passed around until nobody can remember where they got started. One of these urban legends among deep sea divers is the black carpet. The basic gist that I can remember is that this thing is some sort of colony organism, like a giant moving coral. It's a giant black carpet of macrobiotic cells that crawls over the ocean floor, sifting through nutrients with millions of tiny feelers. Nobody has ever gotten a good estimate of the size other than it's big, and apparently makes a noise similar to this bloop thing. One guy apparently saw it swimming/riding the currents as well, so it does more than just crawl on the ocean floor. I suppose you could call it a one-of-a-kind organism, but I'm not sure if that applies to colony organisms like this. According to how the black carpet has been described to me, it shares many similarities to a jellyfish. One story I heard had a diver getting stung by some sort of large feeler strand that apparently hangs off the top, similar to a jellyfish. This was a really old retired diver I talked to who claimed to have seen it. He claimed to have seen an entire decomposing sperm whale being consumed by the carpet. Yet, the way I've heard it described, it shares more similarities with a starfish or a sea anemone than a jellyfish. The marine biologist guy who said he had seen it had some interesting thoughts on what it was. His idea is that it's some sort of holdover or descendant from the very first invertebrate forms of life on Earth. He did a whole long talk about how coral is one of the oldest forms of life on the planet, and the reason why the ocean is the only place teeming with large invertebrate creatures is because that's where all life first evolved. In his mind, jellyfish and all other sea invertebrates probably evolved from this thing rather than vice versa. This giant sea carpet, or whatever, would have been one of the first life forms to ever exist on Earth, technically making it one of our ancient ancestors. This is probably the first story I heard of it, from some Finnish guy with a strong accent. He was doing deep sea diving, repairing some sort of cable. I assume it was probably fiber optic. As he told it, initially he thought he was in the wrong spot because he couldn't find the cable anywhere. He starts searching, and eventually finds one end, just the one, sheared clean through. He gets his dive buddy to stay with that end of the line while he goes looking for the other end, swimming in a straight line in the direction of the other line. In his estimation, he swam about half a mile before he found the other end of the line. He stressed to me that the entire half a mile middle section of the line was just completely gone. It was a huge deal and everyone thought it was the Russians, but this guy was sure that this carpet thing had done it. He said he heard the noise that it apparently makes, even though he never saw it. This next story is from my buddy. He heard it from a guy who heard it from another guy who heard it from another guy, so take it with a heavy grain of salt. This guy is doing a dive, depth, location. What he was doing never got specified, just that he was, quote, really deep. He starts hearing this odd noise that gets associated with the carpet a lot. The way he described it was similar to that video of the bloop. Ultra low pitch, sort of like a super creepy distorted whale song. As he gets closer, he hears this almost static crackling noise as well. The way he described it was like a million prawns getting cracked open at once, if that makes any difference. As he gets closer to the bottom, the noises are getting louder and louder. At this point, he was thinking that he's hearing some sort of sonar from the submarine and some submarine crew is playing a joke on him. When the guy gets to the bottom, he shines his light around, trying to find whatever he's looking for. And what was the seafloor had literally come to life and was crawling past him. This is probably the best description of the carpet that you're going to get. According to this guy, the carpet is at least a mile long/wide, It's made mostly of these strange black feelers that apparently make the strange popping noises. Most of the top is covered in various sand, rocks, debris, etc., with the feelers poking upward. Also a few long transparent stalks, as he described them, that float upwards, some of which were like 20 feet long. According to this guy, it was singing, which doesn't make any sense to me, but whatever. The guy swam back up to the surface and claimed that he had an equipment malfunction. Came back down a few hours later and got there just in time to see the last of the thing disappear. Apparently it stretched as far as the eye could see, which isn't that far at the bottom of the ocean, but still. This one is an old urban legend that's been floating around the diving community for years. Never heard a concrete source of it, so probably never happened. Especially since it involves a submarine crew, so I'm not sure how a diver would have heard about it, since, as far as I know, submarine crews usually stay inside their ship. Anyway, here goes. Submarine is doing something, either war games or patrolling for Chinese/Russian/North Korean/bad guy submarines. The story isn't terribly consistent about this. I hear it different every single time. For whatever reason, they are not using active sonar because they want to avoid detection, floating dead somewhere a couple hundred meters off the sea floor. They're just sitting there, chilling, listening with their sensors, trying to detect enemy submarines or whatever, when they start hearing the noise. Their sensors can't make any sense of it, and it's getting louder at an alarming rate. It starts out as something only the sensors can hear, but before long, the entire crew is hearing this strange, distorted humming or singing that people always associate with the carpet. The captain thinks the only explanation is that there's some sort of new sonar jamming technology, and he orders the sonar crew to send out a ping to locate the source of the noise. This is the part of the story that stays the most consistent, I assume because it's the most memorable. The sonar operator shouts out, "New sonar contact bearing... Sir, what's our depth?" The captain replies, 500 meters, or whatever depth the submarine is supposed to be at. The sonar operator replies, "But sir, the sonar says the sea floor is 10 meters below us." The captain says that's nonsense, and walks over to the sonar station. Checks the reading, walks over to the helmsman, checks the depth. Checks the nautical charts for where they are. Somehow, apparently, the ocean has gotten about 200 meters shallower. The captain orders another ping from the sonar to try and locate the source of the noise. Sonar operator speaks up again, concerned. "Sir, the ocean is getting deeper again." Captain asks him to repeat himself. "Ocean floor is once again at expected depth, sir." Captain takes a look for himself, and sure enough, they are no longer 10 meters above the ocean floor. There is also a very, very large dot on the screen behind the submarine. Captain asks what the large contact is. Sonar operator says, "Equipment malfunction, sir." Captain pings again, just out of curiosity. The equipment malfunction has maintained its shape and is continuing to move away from the submarine, and apparently is taking the strange noise with it. This next story is from the old guy that I talked about earlier. Nice guy, marine biologist who has done both deep sea welds and nature research studies with ROVs. Apparently the carpet ate one of his ROVs on an expedition. According to him, it happened late one night while the rest of the crew was sleeping. He was pulling an all-nighter studying the sea life around volcanic vents. He's moving the ROV from one vent area to the next when he sees what he described as churning sediments on the seafloor, a giant moving cloud of underwater dust essentially moving towards the ROV. He moves in closer and sees what he describes as a colossal echinoderm crawling along the seafloor, with long, dexterous filament probing the seafloor ahead of it. He maneuvers the ROV in for a closer look and uses the arm to prod one of the filaments. In the blink of an eye, he lost contact with the ROV. Apparently, it happened so fast he didn't even see it happen. One second, the thing was about 5 meters away from the vehicle. The next second, it had swallowed the whole thing. His excuse for not having footage was that the footage was all recorded and stored on the ROV rather than being recorded on the operating station, which seems fishy to me. He was, however, very confident in himself, to the extent he claims that he is the discoverer of this new species. He even gave it a name, which I completely forgot because it was so stupid and boring. Giant sea carpet sounds cooler anyway. Way back in the 1980s, I also read a book on cryptids that said there was something called the hide. Apparently it was a flattish thing with eyes along the rim, about the size of a large cowhide, hence the name. From what I recall, the one observation was of such a creature rising up out of an underwater trench to absorb a shark who'd somehow become paralyzed by it. It was observed at some distance by a diver. Supposedly this took place somewhere off the Pacific coast of South America. I've heard plenty of other people who claim to have seen that thing or other similar things. A lot of stuff I've heard from other divers seems like they could be attributed to very rare, large siphonophores that live in the deep sea. It was described to me as sort of a pancake-shaped creature that would hide under the sand with a single, small, near-transparent tentacle floating upwards. The diver touched it, spasmed, and immediately the creature rose out of the sand to devour him. Might as well go on a tangent and talk about some of the other stories I've heard that might be attributed to siphonophores. There was this one old cranky, retired diver who swore he'd seen a sea monster of unfathomable size on a dive once. I always assumed he was full of it, but the way he described it, it sounds a lot like a siphonophore. The story went something like this. He was on a dive doing something that I've forgotten when he sees an absolutely giant tentacle stretching up from the nearby drop-off. The thing was so huge he couldn't, quote, see no beginning nor end to it, and so now he goes around constantly claiming to have come, quote, within a hair breadth of devourment by a gargantuan sea leviathan of unfathomable proportion. And yes, that is exactly how he talked. Looking into these siphonophores, it makes total sense that something like this could exist, though it would be less of a sea monster than a giant serpentine jelly blob sifting through plankton and floating nutrients. Another siphonophore-related story I've heard is one about an absolutely gargantuan jellyfish-type creature that was allegedly about the size of a military submarine. The diver who saw it said the thing was so massive it had somehow developed its own biosphere, with various species of fish circling around and swimming inside it. He described it as having an appearance like a giant upside-down orchid suspended underneath a massive sphere of translucent jelly. The coloration was very dull, but that might have been just due to extreme depth. But according to that old biologist guy, it's not a siphonophore. He qualified that by saying that siphonophores are not fast or mobile. They survive by basically floating around, expending very little energy, and occasionally snagging a meal with the neurotoxin stinger tentacles. He talked for a while about what makes the carpet seemingly a biological impossibility. According to him, something of that size wouldn't get enough food and energy to survive and keep up its level of activity just from scavenging sediment on the seabed. Siphonophores can get really, really huge because they sort of sit around and let food come to them without any energy expenditure. So the profile of the carpet fits more with an active predator or scavenger than a passive one. I mentioned to him that I'd heard stories about decomposing corpses of whales being seen by some people being digested by the carpet, and he got really excited about that. His working theory is that the carpet is an entirely unknown form of life, in the sense that it's a colony organism similar to a siphonophore, but the individual cells are much more complex and capable than those of a siphonophore. Keep in mind this is purely theoretical stuff, and he's trying to explain why something that should be physically and biologically impossible might exist. He studies siphonophores quite extensively, and one thing that remains a mystery is how the cells communicate, considering they have no central nervous system or brain to speak of. They're basically just big bacteria. The key is apparently high-frequency vibrations. He hasn't been able to prove it yet because it's hard to get your hands on a siphonophore to study, but he thinks the individual cells vibrate to communicate with one another and pass a message along the entire organism. His theory is that the carpet is basically the siphonophore equivalent of a Russian nesting doll. Rather than being a colony of individual cells, it is a colony of individual multicellular siphonophores and is therefore the missing link between single-celled life and complex multicellular life. The bloop noise, which the carpet apparently makes, is actually millions of these creatures communicating in their own primitive language. Since siphonophores can reproduce asexually, he envisions the carpet as constantly evolving in size and shape depending on the environment and the amount of food that it can consume. So perhaps after consuming the carcass of a very large creature like a whale or a giant squid, it would be extremely large and have a large amount of cells, but would eventually need to shrink as it self-consumed unneeded cells. The multicellular structure of the carpet serves a twofold purpose, both serving as a distraction from potential predators, similar to a lizard losing its tail while running away, and a long-term storage of nutrients. Since big meals are few and far between at the bottom of the ocean, the carpet stores the energy it consumes by creating more cells and growing larger, which it will consume between meals whenever it needs energy. Not just that, but he's very convinced that the very first forms of life on Earth evolved in the deep ocean near volcanic vents, making the carpet the oldest existing form of life on the planet. But this is just the hypothesis of one guy who apparently saw the carpet once. It's by no means the definitive truth, and this guy hasn't ever actually been able to perform a real scientific study on it. He just saw it once and is drawing conclusions from what little knowledge he has. Have you ever heard of the Raptures of the deep? Few people have. 30 meters below the surface, water pressure alters the properties of gases within the human body. What was once harmless or vital begins to poison your mind. The deeper the depth, the deadlier the poison becomes. Symptoms include impairment, euphoria, laughter, anxiety, hallucinations, hysteria, terror, and death. And yet, we still venture into these depths, risking our lives and our minds, delving into a place where the barrier between the mind and reality becomes thin. Those of us who return can bring with us only memories of that alien world beneath the waves. These are some of those memories, tales from beyond the depths of madness. My first story is not set in the depths of the ocean, but rather on the surface. This story was told to me by the captain of a ship I was on for research work. A good Aussie chap. He always had a good yarn or story to tell about life at sea. At the beginning of his career on the sea, he was the greenhorn on a commercial deep-sea fishing trawler. They mostly caught black cod, though a lot of other fish got caught in the net and discarded. He said that the deeper you laid your nets, the stranger the things you'd pull to the surface would be. Beyond a certain depth, the fish became inedible, their flesh transforming into a pale, gelatinous substance not long after reaching the surface. One night in particular, it seems, this crew set their nets too deep. As the nets raised out of the water, dripping wet, filled with pale, wriggling flesh, it became apparent that something was wrong. The fish were screaming. The noise was unbearable. Some of the crew ran below deck and the rest put in earplugs. After some debate, they opened up the net on the deck to examine the fish. The captain swore that when they did, they saw fish with human faces. Distorted, corpulent, distended, but unmistakably human. And they were screaming. Pale blobs of flesh with drooping faces, fleshy noses, black eyes, wretchedly screaming in anger, pain, or hate. They were quickly thrown overboard, and the crew fished in shallower waters from that point onward. The next story is one of my own. I was doing a mixed gas dive to the bottom, which was 60 meters at this part of a lake. Mostly I was just looking for valuables or other odds and ends that had ended up at the bottom of this lake. When I was a kid, I lost a tooth on a boat trip. I think that was when my fascination with the deep began. My mind fixated on the idea of my tooth sinking to the murky bottom and lying there, lost to the depths, forever. I enjoy finding those lost things and bringing them back to the surface. It's so rare that you can bring something tangible with you from the deep. On this particular day, I brought back with me something that was intangible, yet infinitely more valuable than any treasure. I still had over half my cylinder and was enjoying skimming the lake floor, sifting through the sediment and whatever odds and ends had ended up there. Out of the blue, I had a powerful intuition that I was being watched. I turned around and I saw a man standing there behind me on the ocean floor. He smiled at me broadly and waved his hand. That's when I recognized him in a sort of stilted shock. I was face to face with my dead father on the lake floor, 60 meters below the surface. He pointed to my cylinder and said something, his face wrinkled with concern. He tried to speak. When he opened his mouth, only bubbles came out, and I couldn't understand what he was trying to say. He pointed again, directly at my oxygen regulator. It slowly dawned on me what he was trying to say. My equipment was malfunctioning, giving me an improper mix of gases that at this depth could result in raptures of the deep, or narcosis. At this point, I was aware of the fact that I was hallucinating. I should have started swimming back up immediately, but I couldn't. I had so much unsaid to my father. He had died in a boating accident a few years before, and I hadn't ever really gotten over it. He was just there one moment and gone the next. I never said goodbye. You have certain regrets when someone dies, things left unsaid. I always mulled them over in my mind. I wish I'd said this, why didn't I tell him that before I died? And finally, I had a chance to tell him those things, to have that goodbye. But I couldn't speak because of the stupid rebreather in my mouth. I started to rip off my mask and rebreather so I could talk to him, but he grabbed my hand. I yanked against him and tried to pull off my mask, but he wouldn't let me. Frustrated, I screamed into my mask, bubbles floating up around me in a stream to the surface. And then I felt him pull me into a hug, the kind he used to give me when I was a little kid. And in that instant, I just knew that he understood, that he knew. That this was him saying goodbye. When the bubbles cleared, he was gone. I swam back up to the surface, spent a few minutes at my safety stop, and then surfaced. I know it wasn't real, that it couldn't possibly be real. Besides, I don't believe in ghosts. I know I didn't really see my father or my father's ghost down there. It was probably a manifestation of my subconscious desire or some shit. I'm not a psychologist. Even still, it's hard for me to not want to believe that that was real in some small way. That my mind was more open in that state and he reached out. I'm not sure why. I guess it's just that it felt like he was there. It felt like him. It felt so goddamn much like him. God, I miss him. This next story comes from an intrepid treasure hunter I'm going to call Carl. Carl was a week into a 2-week treasure hunting voyage / vacation. So far he'd had little success and today wasn't any better. It was getting near lunch and so far all he'd done is sit around drinking beer and watching his sonar. Finally, he spots something that piques his interest. A long pole-shaped object jutting out of the ocean floor, propped up against some sort of large rock outcrop. More often than not, Carl says this stuff on sonar ends up just being an old waterlogged tree that's sunk to the bottom. But there's always the chance that it's the mast of a long sunken ship that was shattered by undersea currents, its treasures and artifacts spread across the sea floor. Hoping for a much-needed win, Carl prepped his gear and dove. The descent was uneventful, visibility good, and he was able to spot the wreck from a good distance away. He became more and more convinced that it was a wreck the closer he got, and his excitement grew. Finally reaching the spot, he discovered that the beam was in fact jutting out of the rock rather than leaning against it. The rock was weathered and covered in dead coral and barnacles along with the mast, but the shape was distinctly similar to the hull of a large ship. An intact hull means intact treasure, and Carl eagerly began to search for an entry point so he could investigate the interior. After a few minutes of searching, he couldn't find a single hole or break in the coral-encrusted exterior of the wreck, which is a bit odd given that the ship had sunk. Carl almost gave up hope, until he came across something extremely strange. There was a door, perfectly preserved, sitting embedded in the side of the hull. Carl's first instinct was to open it, but out of nowhere, every single one of his instincts started screaming alarm bells at him. He hadn't seen a single fish or sign of life on or near the wreck. The wreck was old, too old for there to be a perfectly preserved modern door, complete with unrusted brass handle in the side of the hull. He pulled back and took another, closer look at the wreck, as a heavy sense of dread began to overtake him. He found a patch of the mast where the coral crust had fallen away and revealed the true surface. After knocking on it a few times, Carl realized that the mast wasn't made out of wood. It was stone. If the entire wreck was petrified, it was very, very old. Much too old to make any sense. And much too old for there to be a completely preserved modern door in the side of the hull. Who the hell puts a door in the side of their ship's hull anyway? The sense of dread Carl was fearing became overpowering. Every single one of his senses was screaming at him that there shouldn't be this thing here, that he didn't belong. Something was very, very wrong. But there was no way he would just come all the way out here, make the discovery of a lifetime, and just leave. So he swallowed his fear and headed back towards the door. He wasn't going to let nerves take what was possibly one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the century away from him. As he swam around the hole to the section containing the door, the fear intensified until he described it as, "It felt like I was having a complete mental breakdown." Still though, he pushed through his fear and towards the door. As it came into sight, he noticed something was wrong. The door was ajar, and slowly opening from the inside. Carl sat there for what must have been a few full seconds, watching the door open, his entire body screaming at him to run. That was when he felt something else, something watching him from inside the door. Something that Carl could only describe as pure, unthinkable evil. Carl made a mad dash for the surface, hyperventilating and screaming into his mask, not daring to look back as he could feel a presence following behind him, watching with hungry eyes. He shot straight to the surface without any safety stops, flopped onto his boat, headed back towards land at full speed, and managed to call the Coast Guard for help despite being racked with pain from decompression sickness. He was picked up off the ship in a helicopter and flown to the nearest decompression chamber. Thanks to a quick rescue, Carl survived, albeit with permanent joint damage and some paralysis in his left leg that put an end to his treasure hunting career. He refused to share the location of the wreck with me. Some things on the bottom of the ocean aren't meant to be found. If you work as a diver for long enough, you're bound to run into a few people like this. Ultra superstitious guys who believe all sorts of curses, black luck, sea monsters, etc. A common belief you'll find among many of them is this deep sea deity / god / demon called Davy Jones, who roams the seafloor searching for divers or sailors who have displeased him for one reason or another. Whenever someone or something is lost at sea and never recovered, Davy Jones has got it. One guy gave me the description of this Davy Jones that's pretty spooky. The guy claimed to have seen him on one of his dives, a trail of giant footprints approximately as long in length as he was tall, so about 5.5 feet long, since this guy was pretty short. And though he'd never seen it himself, he claimed that one of his friends had. This Davy Jones was a bipedal humanoid that stood over 200 feet tall on tall, stalk-like limbs that were walking along the seafloor, kicking up great clouds of silt behind him as he walked. According to this guy, to look him in the face is instant death, for his visage be too horrifying for any mere man to behold. He was probably just screwing with me, but it's still a cool, spooky story. This next one is a story from Frank, who I may have mentioned earlier. In case I hadn't, Frank was my diving instructor. Absolute legend. Been around a while, seen a lot of strange stuff. He never told me exactly when and where this took place. It's irrelevant in any case. He was taking a group of new diver trainees out on a dive for their certification. Usually they start you out in shallow water, and after a few dives they take you out somewhere deeper. Frank goes out a lot in the ocean a ways to get used to the sensation of being underwater and being unable to see the bottom. It's an important thing to get used to if you're a diver. There's lots of places where the shelf will become a deeper drop-off or potentially hundreds of meters straight down into nothing but the abyss. If you're not used to it, just seeing it can induce panic and terror in certain people. The deep does that to certain people, and I would recommend not becoming a diver if you have some sort of phobia or fear of deep water. Facing your fears is great and all, but having a panic attack while you're 40 meters underwater is a bad idea. Frank said of people who got panicked and scared of deep open water were pretty common. I got pretty scared my first time. But he says there's another reason he's seen. He's only seen it once, but he's heard of it from other diving instructors. The only way that he could describe it was call of the deep. They dropped into the water off the boat, and Frank could immediately tell something was off. This kid hung back from the group, staring down into the water. Frank tried to pull him back, but he shook off his arm and started swimming away, straight down. Frank waited a second, then started after. Caught up at about 30 meters and grabbed his leg. The kid looked back at him and smiled, then pushed away and continued going straight down. Frank followed him for a bit and tried to stop him again, but the guy just kept going further and further down. Eventually, Frank had to stop and let him go or risk dying himself. To this day, Frank says it's the most unnerving shit he's ever seen. What could possibly compel a man to just swim straight down into the ocean? What did he think awaited him down there? The kid's body was never found. The parents sued Frank, but he was exonerated by the testimony of the other trainees who backed up his claims. Police chalked it up to the kid being suicidal, but I'm pretty sure there's a long list of better ways to kill yourself. And like I said, this isn't an isolated incident. No cause or motivation has ever been determined, and the reason for why these people swim to their deaths remains a mystery. I was doing a recovery dive at a local lake for the police. Some idiot kid who hadn't worn his life jacket while drinking on a party boat. It was deep enough to require mixed gas to avoid narcosis. I was following all the normal protocols, keeping in contact with my diving partner, watching my dive computer. It doesn't take long to get to the bottom. Getting back up takes longer. Me and my partner split up to cover more ground because visibility was extremely low. It must have been about 5 minutes before I saw it. There was a human silhouette standing straight upright at the bottom of a lake. I swam closer, and I found a man, perfectly preserved without a sign of decay on his body. He was buried in silt up to his shins. It really looked like he could still be alive, or had only been dropped into the water a few moments ago. I tied a line to him and started to head back up to the surface so I could get the boat team to haul up the body. So I swam up, letting the line play out behind me until I reached my first safety stop. While I'm waiting for my body to decompress so I can head up further, I noticed that the spool of line is still being pulled out even though I've stopped. It's completely taut, and it's rolling straight down at blistering speed. It takes me about a second to realize that my reel is about to run out, and I am about to be sucked down by this line. There's a good 900 feet on the line, and the speed it was being reeled out was tremendous. As soon as I tried to grab it, my hand was almost split open to the bone. In retrospect, that was a dumb thing to do, but it was basic instinct to grab the rope and try to cut it with my knife. I get a sudden IQ boost and instead cut the straps holding the reel to my suit a few seconds before the line runs out, and it vanishes into the murky water about half a second later. I feel as if the force of the whiplash alone would have been enough to break my back and kill me if I hadn't cut the straps. I'm pretty shaken at this point. More shaken than I've ever been since finding my first dead kid. But I still managed to ascend slowly and take my safety spots despite the pain, fear, and of course blood leaking out of me. Good thing this was a freshwater dive or I might have been in real trouble on my way up. Anyway, my knee-jerk reaction, what everybody else told me, was that it was some narcosis-fueled hallucination. Divers see all sorts of stuff when narcosis kicks in. I've heard stories of fish and squid with human faces. Some guy swears he saw Cthulhu. My point is, narcosis is to an extent like temporarily being on DMT. It can make you see some absolutely crazy shit. The thing I can't make sense of is how I got the cut on my hand. It's clearly from the rope. It's not clean enough to be from my knife or any other sharp object. The doctor even noted that I had friction burns all around the cut. So what caused it if I was hallucinating? If I wasn't hallucinating, what could drag a line that fast? What really keeps me up at night is the guy was resting on the bottom of a lake and my line was going straight down. So either he was pulled through the bottom of the lake, or something with incredible strength and speed grabbed my rope and was reeling me like a fish. I'm not sure which is worse. You might want to sit this next one out if you have a combined phobia of the deep sea and spiders. Now, spiders aren't the sort of thing you think you'd encounter in the ocean. I know there are aquatic spider species, but those usually are very small and live in ponds. Spiders aren't something you'd think to see at, say, the bottom of the ocean. Well, I'm here to inform you that sea spiders absolutely do exist. They're mostly harmless, but then again, so are many land spiders. They're long, gangly things that are all legs with two grasping arms and a proboscis for sucking up their prey's insides. They're not supposed to get any bigger than about 2 feet in diameter. And I say not supposed to because lots of strange things seem to happen at the bottom of the ocean. Our intrepid diver in this story was after some sunken treasure and had just dove to investigate what he hoped was an undiscovered wreck that he'd spotted on sonar. He descended to the bottom, but to his dismay, the wreck was simply a strange rock formation on the bottom. Disappointed, he prepared to ascend. Just as he checked his dive computer, he noticed something out the corner of his eye, a massive wall of sand approaching him from behind. Underwater sandstorms aren't anything unusual. They're just like sandstorms above water, except significantly more wet. It's just currents stirring up sediment and throwing it around. Our friend managed to grab onto a rock and hold his position steady as the current slowly faded, leaving only a murky water filled with sediment. Letting go of the rock, he turned upward and came face to face with a large barracuda, impaled on the end of a long, transparent tube. The tube stretched up and vanished into the murk. Visibility was below 10 feet. Now the diver was getting spooked, so he went back down to the bottom and swam along the ocean floor for a while to bypass whatever had skewered the fish. That's when he nearly ran face first into its leg. According to his description, the leg was skinny proportionately, but still about 1/4 foot in diameter, and it stretched up into the murk beyond above him. He stared up at it for a few seconds, then it began to ever so slowly move, gripping the ocean floor as it moved the rest of the mass that must have hung suspended above, hidden in the murk. The thing moving spooked our friendly treasure hunter enough for him to probably break a couple Olympic records in his mad dash and swim to safety. Fortunately, He retained enough sense to wait at his safety stops, though I can hardly blame him for being scared after seeing a giant underwater spider. These next stories are about a phenomenon I witnessed which has been corroborated and seen by many other commercial and hobby divers. If you've been diving a lot or spend a lot of time around divers, you might have already guessed what I'm about to talk about. Black divers, one of the most persistent and unnerving legends that has plagued diving since the time of the giant metal ball helmets. This story comes from early in my time as a commercial diver on a Hibernia rig. The rig is the biggest in the world and is absolutely massive. Basically a small city jutting out of the seafloor. The entire thing is on top of a massive concrete platform settled on the bottom of the ocean that's also used to store barrels of crude. Even back when I was doing this, safety regulations were very important. Unlike most of my other jobs where I inspect and repair the integrity of structures themselves, I was checking the oil storage to ensure it was safe, secure, and not leaking out of containment. It was good work, steady work, inspecting the site nearly every day, and it paid well. Usually I worked with a group of 2 other divers. The day this happened was like pretty much any other. The weather was shit, the onboard chef's omelet was delicious, and the rig workers were assholes. Nothing new. Beginning the dive, I reached my target and began inspection of the lids, seams, etc., and was taking water samples as well to ensure no minute particulate leakage. After a few minutes, I got a feeling on the back of my neck that I'm being watched. I turn around to see one of my partners floating a distance away from me, watching me work. I wave at him and give the OK sign to signify that I'm okay, and he returned it. I wasn't sure why he was watching me instead of doing his own work, but I really didn't care. I had a feeling in my gut, though, that something wasn't right. I mulled it over in my mind while I worked. Something about him seemed off, but I had no idea what it was. So I turned around again after a bit, and sure enough, he was still there, watching me. I waved to him and made the OK sign again, and he returned it. Something about the way that he did it made me feel disgusted and repulsed. The fingers looked wrong, if that makes any sense. I don't remember enough detail to describe exactly how they moved incorrectly, but I felt a distinct, uncanny value level repulsion upon seeing it. I was looking at something very, very wrong. My gut instinct was screaming at me that this guy was dangerous. That's when I realized what had actually been bugging me initially. The guy didn't have any bubbles coming out of his regulator. Oh shit, this guy has a regulator. My diving partner has a rebreather. This isn't my diving partner. Wait, how can this guy be giving off 0 bubbles without a rebreather? Here's where I need to explain a bit of technical stuff for the non-initiated. Regulators are those typical scuba masks that you see. You breathe in air from them and exhale into the sea. Rebreathers are much bulkier and they recycle the air that you're exhaling and reuse it so you get more bang for your buck. Better for longer and deeper dives than a regulator. Regulators make bubbles, rebreathers don't. Like I said, all our guys on the rig used rebreathers. It was company policy and it was full stop the best option. This diver was using a regulator, and on top of that he wasn't making any bubbles, which is just all kinds of wrong. I stare at him for a second. He just floats there, staring back at me through the gloomy water. My stupid search and rescue recovery instincts kick in, and I assume that this diver is having an emergency malfunction with his rebreather and he can't breathe and he's possibly already unconscious or dead. So I try and stuff down the blaring warning signs in my gut and swim over to him as quickly as I can. The warning signs get worse the closer I get. There's just something about this guy that is wrong. Somehow. I can't describe it in any other way, but I just instinctively knew that he shouldn't exist, that he was wrong. My gut finally got the better of me, just as I reached to pull his broken regulator so we could share my rebreather on the way up. I stopped my hand a few inches away from his mask, and I felt an intense jolt of fear staring down into his mask. There was nothing behind his mask. It was completely empty. No eyes, no face, No skull, no corpse, nothing. Just empty blackness. I reached out with my hand and touched the top of his head. The wetsuit hood squished inwards as I pushed, deforming the shape of his head. That's when it moved. The thing turned its mask up towards my face, raising its hand and making the OK sign again. My body was in full fight or flight mode at this point, and I'm no pussy, but spooky phantom divers are pretty far past my limits of what I'm willing to fight. So I swam away, putting a decent distance between us before I dared to look back. When I turned to look, I saw the diver floating backwards into the current, leaking black oil or blood or something from his mask, arms, and legs. It wasn't long before he was hidden entirely behind this black cloud, vanishing into the murky sea. I went back up to the surface as quickly as humanly possible, assuming that I had a bad mix of gas or a malfunctioning rebreather that caused narcosis. The maintenance crews never found anything wrong with my gear, though that doesn't rule out the possibility of narcosis hallucinations. There's a couple of different names for them. Phantom divers, ghost divers, black divers. The stories aren't all the same. There's two basic types of phantom diver encounters. The ones with a body and the ones without. Some people report seeing a corpse or a skeleton behind the mask. Others saw what I saw, which is a seemingly empty black void of nothing inside except water. The common thread shared through most stories is the lack of bubbles and the black blood or mist emitted by the phantom diver. Not all stories have the black mist, but the majority do. There's a couple possibilities here. It could be an actual supernatural phenomenon. Weird shit happens in the ocean. Divers die all the time. Could the ocean have some sort of property that traps the souls of those who die here, dooming them to float aimlessly on currents as ghostly phantoms? I won't rule it out. I've seen stuff that defies explanation time and again. It could also be what I like to call a mind virus. You'll see it a lot among the DMT and psychedelics communities. These drugs are a window into your subconscious through the thought process. So if you go in with certain expectations or knowledge, even if you don't realize that you are, it will affect your experience. It's possible that people see phantom divers because they've heard stories about them, and it's something that their subconscious mind jumps to when it experiences narcosis hallucinations. Which would mean that by spreading these stories, I am in fact contributing to the spread of this idea. I talked to that old biologist again about this. We're going to call him Murray to make my life a little easier. Now, Murray is a bit of a character. He talks and swears like an old sea captain despite being a marine biologist, and always seems to have a ready excuse for why he has no proof of the things that he's apparently seen. I'm not particularly inclined to believe him most days of the week, but I still find his stories fascinating. I asked him for a bit more in-depth explanations on the creatures that he's seen and his thoughts. His belief is that there is an unknown sentient species of cephalopod in the ocean. Cephalopods are squids, octopi, etc., in case you're wondering. Cephalopods are strange creatures with remarkable abilities to mimic other forms of life. They also have a level of intelligence that has still to this day not been fully studied or documented. Octopi in the wild and captivity have been recorded to wave back at humans in an almost friendly manner. Supposing that an unknown, intelligent species of cephalopod existed, if it did not want to be found, it would be extremely difficult or impossible to find it. Their ability to hide and mimic other forms of life is unmatched, especially if matched with a keen intellect. The creature described by Murray was able to create a near-perfect mimicry of a bottlenose dolphin. This is actually completely within the realm of possibility. There is a species of octopus known as the mimic octopus that mimics a wide variety of creatures with stunning accuracy. This is achieved via a complete control of the shape, texture, and color of its body. It's possible that this unknown deep-sea mimic is also responsible for the black diver phenomenon. A cephalopod of sufficient size could easily mimic human movement and mannerisms from the inside of a wetsuit. The black blood indicates this might be the case. I wonder what these mimics might think of us humans, invaders from the land. What secrets or mysteries might they hold? Could they have secret cities hidden in great unknown caverns at the bottom of the sea? What purpose does imitating a human diver serve? Are they just observing us, or are their plans more sinister? The entire idea, frankly, has me a bit on the edge. These things could be hiding anywhere, disguised as anything. I might have swam past one a dozen times, been watched by them hundreds. Do they know me? Do they have a name for me? If these things exist, I think it's better that they remain hidden, and these questions remain unanswered. I tried to convince Murray of this, but he remains dead set on proving that they exist. There's one more question that's itching at the back of my mind. If it was a cephalopod in that empty diving suit I saw, where the hell did they get the suit? They must either scavenge the suits from dead divers or actively murder divers to steal their suits and gear. I've heard enough stories about murderous octopi to not like where that one is going one bit. So, if you find yourself often beneath the waves of the ocean, as I do, be wary of any unknown divers and objects that don't belong.